Hey everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today we will be painting some cactus, and well, I thought we could be playing with some shadows and some highlights on the cactus, and I think this will be fun. I started off with tracing my sketch. I'm using a graphite paper. I did made my sketch on just a regular printing paper and then tracing it using that graphite paper onto my watercolor paper. You probably already know by now, but I really do like to make my sketch on just regular paper and not on watercolor paper, because lots of times, especially if the sketch is a little bit more complicated, you can just ruin your watercolor paper by erasing it, going over it with a razor. So I do like to make my sketch on a regular paper and then trace it. Of course, for tracing you can use a window. I'm using a watercolor block, so it is quite, well, not possible for me to use a window for tracing, so I'm using a graphite paper. But if you're just using just a sheet of paper, you can just trace it on your window easily. Also, as always, I did prepare a sketch for you that you can download for free from my website, so the link is down in the description box. Go ahead, check it out, download the sketch for yourself, trace it, and we can get started. All the materials I will be using for this painting are listed down in the description box, so of course you can go ahead and check that out. Prepare your paints, your brushes, and if you're looking for some supplies, to buy supplies, you can also find links there of my affiliate links for Amazon. So if you make a purchase using those links, I will get a small commission, and of course be very grateful to you, because that is how I actually finance my supplies and these videos. Also, when I finish with tracing my sketch, I will just use a kneaded eraser to just slightly lighten it a bit, but I don't think that is the main thing I'm using it here, because you know, the sketch doesn't have to be very light, particularly at the place where the cactus is, but I do want to pick up the excess graphite, so I'm using a kneaded eraser for that. And without further ado, let's get started with our painting. I've premixed the Ultramarine, Sepia and Cadmium yellow medium to get this grayish color, but also one that goes a little bit, that has a little bit of that yellow in it. And I am just starting with painting my background, and this time, you can't believe it, I did not pre-wet the background, but I'm painting wet on dry, because I don't want my background to be quite smooth. I do want some unevenness. I do want it to have some texture in it, because this is an old wall and does have a lot of texture on it. Some cracks, some discoloration, you know, everything that makes it an old wall. So I thought the easiest and best way to achieve that is to paint wet on dry. So I did not pre-wet the paper. Also, I'm adding a little bit of that cadmium yellow medium and just tapping here and there the paint just to make it even more uneven. Also, the little wall on which my cactus is, I've painted in the same colors, and right now I'm adding a little bit of the shadows on the right side. For my painting, I'm using a larger brush. This one is, I think, number 10, and well, I do want a larger brush because, you know, I think that with a larger brush you can cover larger surfaces and also paint a little bit looser. And this painting isn't very loose, but it's also isn't very realistic. So I do believe that using a larger brush will help me actually achieve that little bit looser look. Now I switched to a smaller round brush. This is, I think, number 4, just to add in a little bit more pigment, you know, because with a smaller brush it holds a lot less water. So when I pick up my pigment for palette, it doesn't get even more diluted and it stays slightly more pigmented, you know, the pigment stays less diluted, so it just does help me to add a little bit more of the pigment. Also, I was picking up some paints here and there to, well, just to make the impression that those are shadows in the background and on my wall. After the paint on my background completely dried, I'm switching off to painting the cactus, and for that I am using green and olive green and just adding it on my cactus. I started painting it with a little bit larger brush, but then later on switched to a smaller one because I don't want it, this is quite small, that that cactus is quite small and I don't want just too much water in my brush. I do want it to be a little bit less watered, so I am using a smaller brush. And I painted with that mix of green and olive green, the lighter color, and then I'm adding here and there a little bit of only green to make some shadows, and in that way also make appear that some parts of the cactus are a little bit more in the light and some are a little bit more in the shadow. Also for the shadows I'm using only the sepia, and some of the cactus leaves are quite dark because they're very very much in a shadow, so they will be quite dark, almost black. With a detail brush I'm now adding some details to my cactus, some dots and lines to make it appear that there are some spikes. Again, I'm not sure, the spikes, so I'm using a detail brush to add them on the leaves. With the white gouache, I'll be also adding some highlights on the cactus, also just tapping the paint here and there, making some parts even lighter. Now I'm mixing some ultramarine and sepia to create that beautiful grayish color to paint in the shadows in the walls. Also, with that mix, I will be painting the shadows of the cactus on the wall. And with that mix of those two colors, I'm also adding some even darker shadows on my cactus. Shadows on the wall, I also wouldn't be painting in the same wash, but I will paint in one layer a little bit lighter and then add a little bit darker parts, because I do want that shadow to look slightly different, and I think it does make it more realistic and more believable than if it was just one even wash. Again, I slightly pivoted the part where my shadows on the walls are on the right side and added a little bit more of the pigment there to add in a little bit more of the shadows. Also, the same thing I did for the wall on which my cactus is sitting on. When painting that brick wall, first thing I'm doing is adding the shadows or the darker parts between the bricks, and later on I will be painting the bricks because I think that's the easiest way. I like to paint in first those shadows and then add a little bit of color, a little bit of red color to paint in the bricks. And with a detail brush I'm painting in some cracks in that wall and some details also. For the bricks, I'm using a mix of cadmium red light and sepia to paint in the first layer, and then on top of it, while it's still wet, I'm adding a little bit of only sepia and a little bit of raw sienna, and just a little bit again of that cadmium red light here and there, just to make those bricks uneven. For the top of the wall, first layer I painted in gray with a mix of ultramarine and sepia. I'm also using that mix of cadmium red light and sepia and just painting it in a light wash, and then again adding a little bit of sepia here and there. Right now, for the side of the wall, I'm using some burnt sienna. So just I'm mixing up those colors that I think that would be actually suitable for those bricks and the top of the brick wall. But of course, you can use any colors. If you don't have those colors, you can use any brownish and slightly red going into orange colors to paint in those bricks. Also, now I was adding a little bit more of the texture. Now that the paper is dry, I see I'm missing a little bit of the texture in my background, in the back wall. So I was just adding a little bit of paint here and there, and I did not pre-wet the paper. And then later on with a script brush, I'm again here also adding some cracks in the wall. I noticed that my camera stopped, so actually I did not record the first part of painting that pot in which my cactus is, but you know, I've painted it with the same colors I used for the brick wall, but just added a little bit of cadmium yellow medium to get that yellowish color, more orangey and yellowish color, and painted in the first layer, also just topping in. I did not pre-wet the paper, I'm just adding the pigment, and then with the sepia I just added a little bit of the shadows and darker spots on my pot. Afterwards, I moved on to painting even more details on my wall and just added those places where the bricks are separated, those darker parts, and just making the distinction and painting in some details on that wall. Now I used also even more white gouache to add in the highlights on my cactuses, because I did want some parts to be even a little bit more highlighted. And also on my pot I added a little bit more of the shadows using sepia. When I look at the overall picture, I noticed that my cactuses were just a little bit bland, so I did wanted to add a little bit more of the color, and I used that olive green and cadmium yellow medium to paint in another layer on my cactus, just to make it a little bit more vibrant and to stand out a little bit more. I was missing a color, and also I added a couple of more details on the pot and some sprinkles on my back wall, just to finish off the painting. And with that I was done with the painting and also with this video. Thank you guys a lot for watching, for all your support. I hope you like this video, and if you do, please hit the like button, share it, comment, and if you haven't still, please subscribe to my channel. It would really mean a lot to me. And without further ado, I hope I'll see you next time. Bye!